What does it sound like when a nation's favorite entertainer stops being a household name and becomes the subject of a criminal charge? You're listening to 102 Hours where stories don't just get told, they come alive in the dark. Picture a studio light warming a painted face, a laugh tracked into microphones, a child leaning close to watch a portrait finished in 60 seconds. Then imagine that very image splintering under the weight of accusation. You probably won't survive this emotionally. But that won't stop us. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to 102 Hours, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I like to know where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum and let 102 Hours guide you into tonight's journey. This episode is about Rolf Harris, the fall of Australia's beloved entertainer. You begin at the surface: the smile, the thick black glasses, the genial wave, the wobble board that made television audiences clap along without caring whether it was a proper instrument. Rolf Harris, born in Perth in 1930, had the kind of charisma that television producers loved. He could paint a portrait in minutes, write novelty songs, and keep children entertained with cartoon animals. He wasn't just a man with a career, he was a household fixture, present in living rooms across Britain and Australia. But if you lean closer, you hear something else: whispers. A painted smile, after all, can hide a crack. For decades, those whispers didn't make the papers. The tabloids printed headlines about his royal commissions, his charity appearances, his endless television specials. When he was awarded an MBE, then an OBE, then a CBE, and even the Order of Australia, the official record glowed like varnished wood. A beloved family entertainer, a safe pair of hands. Yet, investigators would later note that in the shadow of all this acclaim, stories began to circulate: small, almost private allegations of behavior that didn't fit the public image. People in the entertainment industry sometimes mentioned him as too touchy or too familiar with fans. Back then, no one in power seemed willing to take it seriously. It was the 1960s, then the 70s, then the 80s, decades when celebrity often outweighed suspicion. You're left wondering, if someone had acted sooner, would the fall have been less brutal, or would it have come at all? You also can't ignore a strange detail. Harris was trained in art, not just as a performer, but as a portraitist. He studied under Haywood Veal at the City and Guilds of London Art School and spent years honing a style that looked spontaneous, even though it was built on technical control. That ability to appear casual while being completely calculated would later take on a darker, metaphorical weight. Investigators still question whether his public charm was a mask rehearsed as carefully as his brushstrokes. The first real crack in the painted smile came not from a newspaper, but from a much broader sweep of justice. In 2012, the UK launched Operation Yewtree, a police investigation into historic sexual offences following the revelations about Jimmy Savile. Dozens of celebrities, past and present, came under scrutiny. Some were cleared, others faced charges, and then quietly, almost without fanfare at first, Harris's name appeared on the list. For many, it was a shock. Surely not him, the wobbleboard man, the one who painted the Queen. The atmosphere around those first charges was thick with disbelief. On one side, you had fans who clung to their image of the entertainer as a national treasure. On the other, accusers who had lived with memories for decades, only to be told, again and again, that nobody would believe them. The collision of those two narratives, adoration versus accusation, was the sound of the smile cracking. There's a quirky footnote here that makes you tilt your head. While Harris was preparing for his trial, museums quietly began pulling his paintings from public view. Even a portrait of the Queen, unveiled in 2005 to much acclaim, was suddenly awkward to display. You can still find photographs of it, but it rarely surfaces in exhibitions now. Art historians debate whether the work should be judged on technique alone, or whether the artist's crimes permanently stain the canvas. You probably know the answer in your own heart. You can't separate the two. This is the part where you imagine yourself in the room, the studio full of props, the smell of paint, the sound of laughter. Then picture a knock at the door, officers arriving with a warrant, the silence that falls over a household used to applause. Harris was first arrested in November 2012, questioned about offences said to have taken place decades earlier. The smile might still have been painted on his face, but the varnish had begun to peel, and if you lean closer, you notice the shift. Journalists who once wrote puff pieces now chased leads. TV networks that once repeated his specials at Christmas quietly edited him out of retrospectives. Fans who grew up with his songs suddenly questioned every lyric, every onstage gesture. A wobbleboard can't drown out that kind of silence. What makes this first crack so eerie is its ordinariness. Nothing exploded in the tabloids overnight. Instead, the image eroded little by little. An arrest, a charge, a report from the Crown Prosecution Service. Each announcement chipped at the glossy exterior. Until then, his name had meant family entertainment. Now, the same name meant investigation. By the time his trial date was set in April 2014, the smile was no longer believable. The portrait had split. You, sitting here in the dim light, know how it ends: convictions, disgrace, prison. But in those early days, the question still hung in the air. Could it really be true? Or was this another case of celebrity under siege? Investigators still question whether those early whispers, those private remarks dismissed at parties, those rumors brushed aside in the 1970s, could have saved people from harm if they'd been taken seriously. But history doesn't deal in hypotheticals. History paints what happened, not what should have happened. You start in Perth, Western Australia, 1930. The sky is wide, the streets are quiet, and into this post-depression world comes a boy named Rolf Harris. You picture him as a child, curious, restless, always fiddling with pencils and paints. His father, Cromwell Harris, was a Welsh migrant, and his mother, Agnes, was Australian. They encouraged their son's interest in art and performance, not knowing those twin obsessions, canvas and stage, would eventually build and then destroy his reputation. The early history is surprisingly ordinary. Harris attended Bessendian Primary School, then Perth Modern, a selective public school known for turning out bright minds. He was smart, but also eccentric. He once sketched caricatures of teachers to make classmates laugh. There's a quirk here. He was also a champion swimmer. At 16, he broke the Australian junior record for the 110-yard backstroke. Imagine the parallel timeline if art and entertainment hadn't called. Perhaps he'd have been known as a Commonwealth Games athlete. Investigators still question whether that discipline from swimming, the training, the constant need for performance under pressure later fed into the careful showmanship he brought to stage and screen. When he turned 19, Harris packed his bags for London. Picture it, 1952, post-war Britain, rationing still clinging to daily life. The Australian youth studied art at the City and Guilds of London Art School, working under portraitist Hayward Veal. He didn't just paint, he learned performance as a second language. London was the capital of variety television, and Harris, armed with a strong accent and a quirky musical sensibility, stood out. He tinkered with instruments, eventually inventing the wobble board, essentially a sheet of hardboard flexed rhythmically. At first, producers thought it was a novelty. Then they realized novelty was his brand. By 1955, Harris had appeared on the BBC with his own television series. You can imagine him, wide-eyed, in front of early cameras that hummed with heat. He wasn't polished. He was enthusiastic, almost cartoonish in his delivery. Audiences loved it. Kids laughed at his goofy songs, and adults found his energy infectious. Slowly, the boy from Perth became a fixture in British living rooms. One mainstream fact stands tall here. His 1960 single, Tie Me Kangaroo Down, sport hit #1 in Australia and #3 in the UK charts, even cracking the US Billboard Hot 100. It was silly, catchy, and utterly memorable. Radio stations played it endlessly, and in a quirk that feels almost surreal today, the Beatles once provided backup vocals for him in a recording session. Yes, those Beatles. A reminder of just how far his charm carried him. Television deepened the connection. In the 1960s and 70s, Harris fronted children's shows where he painted giant canvases live on air, starting with loose brushstrokes that looked abstract until, suddenly, an animal or face appeared. Viewers gasped as the image emerged. That trick, appearing chaotic, then revealing control, became his calling card. Schools invited him to perform. Charities asked him to appear. If you were a child in Britain or Australia, then chances are you saw him smiling from the screen. And with fame came legitimacy. In 1968, he was awarded an MBE. In 1977, an OBE. By 2006, he was a CBE. The British establishment loved him. He even painted an official portrait of Queen Elizabeth II for her 80th birthday in 2005. Imagine that journey, from Perth schoolboy to painting the monarch. For decades, that was a story most people told, an immigrant success tale, proof of what talent and hard work could achieve. But while you nod along to this glowing resume, a small question lingers. What about the whispers? Those two touchy moments at meet and greets, the sense from some colleagues that he blurred boundaries. It was background noise then, easily dismissed. Yet in hindsight, you see how the image of the beloved entertainer created a shield. When people hold you up as a national treasure, who dares pull you down? The quirky tidbit you don't expect. Harris was also a pioneer in television education. In the 1960s, he appeared on British schools' programming, teaching children how to draw and paint. Generations of kids credit him with sparking their first interest in art. He published drawing books, some of which still sit on dusty library shelves. The paradox is brutal. He shaped young imaginations while, decades later, being accused of harming young people. The contrast makes the crack in the painted smile feel even sharper. As you lean in, you notice how seamlessly the entertainer blended two worlds. He was Australian enough to be exotic, British enough to be safe. That dual identity let him conquer both markets. When he returned to Australia for tours, he was hailed as a son of the soil who had made it big overseas. When he stayed in Britain, he was the lovable Aussie uncle. Either way, his brand was warmth. And you, sitting here with the faint hum of your fan, recognize the trap. Warmth and charisma can be masks. Investigators still question whether Harris's meteoric rise provided the perfect camouflage charm as cover, applause as a shield. So, from Perth to prime time, the smile grew brighter, the wobble board louder, the portraits larger. The boy who could have been a swimmer instead became a star. But a star, you remind yourself, is only bright until the cracks show through. You picture a canvas leaning against an easel, the smell of oil paint drifting through a studio. The entertainer you once thought of as a novelty act had become something else, a cultural figure invited into the highest circles. Rolf Harris wasn't he just strumming a wobbleboard on children's television anymore. He was stepping into palaces, shaking hands with royals, and painting portraits that would hang in national collections. It's 1986, and Harris is already an officer of the Order of the British Empire. Later, in 2006, he would become a commander of the Order of the CBEN, honor bestowed by Queen Elizabeth II herself. Australia, too, joined in the praise, making him an officer of the Order of Australia in 1989. Imagine that, a kid from Perth, once sketching caricatures of his teachers, now knighted in spirit, if not in title. You, sitting here in the dim room, can almost hear the applause from banquet halls. But the highlight of his establishment embrace came in 2005, when Harris was commissioned to paint the Queen for her 80th birthday. Picture the scene. He stands in Buckingham Palace, his paints carefully laid out, his brushes arranged by size. The monarch, sitting patiently, allows herself to be transformed by his hand. Harris worked quickly, building the image in layers, giving the Queen a warm, approachable expression. When it was unveiled, critics were mixed, but the public loved it. The painting was displayed in the Queen's gallery. For Harris, it was the pinnacle, recognition not just as an entertainer, but as an artist of stature. And here's the quirky detail. While working on the portrait, Harris reportedly broke protocol by chatting informally with the Queen. He joked, he smiled, he called her ma'am with his lilting Australian accent. Journalists noted how relaxed she looked under his brush, a stark contrast to the stiff portraits usually commissioned. That image, a queen softened by an entertainer's charms, seemed to encapsulate his entire brand. The man who could disarm even royalty. You need to remember, during these years, Harris wasn't just popular, he was trusted. Governments and institutions wheeled him out for national celebrations. He performed at the opening of the Sydney Opera House in 1973. He sang at Queen Elizabeth's Golden Jubilee concert in 2002, wobbleboard and all. He appeared on children's charity telethons, visited hospitals, and was made a kind of mascot for decency. When he painted, he was on just painting animals or landscapes. He was painting himself into the very fabric of national identity. And yet, even here, the shadow lingers. Investigators still question whether this closeness to institutions, the royal family, the BBC, the Australian government, created a protective aura that discouraged scrutiny. If you're rubbing shoulders with monarchs, who dares to question your behavior at a backstage meet and greet? If you've got medals on your chest, who would believe a teenager whispering otherwise? As you sit with this contradiction, another quirky tidbit surfaces. Harris was also a television art teacher. His BBC series Rolf's Cartoon Club in the 1980s invited children to send in drawings, some of which he pinned to the set wall. He would demonstrate cartoon techniques, encouraging kids to have a go. Generations remember sending envelopes of sketches, hoping to see their work on air. It sounds charming until you hold it up against what later came out in court. The juxtaposition is almost unbearable. The man celebrated for inspiring children, later convicted of indecent assault against girls. This is the tension you need to hold in your mind. Public warmth, private allegations, establishment trust, whispered doubts. A wobbleboard ringing out in concert halls, a brush painting the Queen, and somewhere in the shadows, stories that didn't reach daylight until decades later. The smile looked unbreakable during these years. When Harris stood before the Queen with paintbrush in hand, no one in the audience of history thought they were watching a man whose reputation would collapse in courtrooms. If anything, the brushstrokes seemed to cement him in place, a permanent fixture of British cultural life. But brushstrokes dry and varnish cracks. The very ties that lifted Harris so high would later make the fall more dramatic. After all, when you're welcomed into royal palaces, your disgrace doesn't just echo in tabloids. It reverberates through the very institutions that once applauded you. So, here you are, in the half-light of your own room, thinking about a man who painted monarchs and sang novelty songs, whose medals shone brighter than the whispers dared to. The brushstrokes seemed permanent. But nothing in paint or reputation ever truly is. You hear it first as a ripple, not a crash. A police investigation in Britain, launched in 2012, called Operation Yewtree. Its purpose, to uncover the scale of historic sexual abuse in the wake of revelations about Jimmy Savile, the television host once considered untouchable. Suddenly, names that had felt like permanent fixtures in popular culture were being read out on evening news bulletins, not in celebration, but in suspicion. And among those names, Rolf Harris. Think about the timing. By 2012, Harris was in his early 80s. He was retired from much of his public work, still holding his honors, still an occasional presence on television. To many, he seemed like the epitome of a harmless old entertainer. But Operation Yewtree had widened its net. It wasn't just about Savile, it was about anyone in the entertainment industry accused of historic offenses. Harris was arrested in November of that year, questioned and released on bail. The tabloids hinted at an unnamed entertainer, but before long, the name was confirmed. Imagine being in that moment, a fan who grew up with his shows. One day you're flipping through channels, seeing reruns of Rolf's Cartoon Club. The next, you're hearing that the same man is under police investigation. The wobbleboard, once a symbol of cheerful absurdity, now carried a chill. A mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. Operation Yewtree resulted in 589 alleged victims coming forward against multiple figures, though not all accusations led to charges. Harris was one of the highest profile arrests to emerge from it. That detail matters, because it shows his case wasn't isolated. He was part of a reckoning in British culture, a moment when the country began to face how institutions had protected celebrities from scrutiny. But there's a quirky side note you probably don't know. While under investigation, Harris continued to appear in public. In 2012, months after his arrest, he unveiled a painting at an exhibition in London. The event was hushed, awkward. Reporters were already circling. Some visitors claimed they felt a strange disconnect, applauding the brushstrokes while knowing the police were closing in. That painting, once meant to be a celebration, became a reminder of the silence that had settled around him. Investigators still question whether his arrest should have come earlier. Rumors had floated for decades, whispers at television studios, concerns brushed off as misunderstandings. If Operation Yewtree hadn't existed, would those cases have stayed hidden forever? Or was it only the cultural shift post-Savile that finally made space for accusations against beloved figures to be taken seriously? The image of Harris being interviewed under caution is hard to shake. He was elderly, frail-looking, yet the allegations were decades old, stretching back to the late 1960s and beyond. You sit here, hearing the quiet hum in your room, and picture that contrast. The once vibrant entertainer facing a police interview tape recorder. The lights are harsher than studio lamps, the questions colder than any he fielded from fans. And yet, denial was his first instinct. Harris maintained that the accusations were false, that he had done nothing criminal. His supporters echoed this, some arguing that he was too easy a target, too visible a celebrity. But the Crown Prosecution Service thought differently. In August 2013, charges were filed, 12 counts of indecent assault against 4 female victims, plus later charges added to the indictment. The smile, once painted so perfectly, was cracking into shards. The quirky tidbit for you to hold on to. When news of the charges broke, several shops in Britain quietly removed Harris's music CDs and art books from their shelves. Imagine walking into a bookstore and seeing empty spaces where his books once sat. Retailers didn't want to be associated with his name. That absence, the missing wobble board on a shelf, was louder than any song. And so, Operation Yewtree didn't just knock on Harris's door. It changed the entire cultural frame. It reminded people that no one, not even a beloved royal portraitist, was immune from scrutiny. You lean back in your chair, the fan still humming, and let that reality sink in. When the police come knocking, applause can't drown them out. Picture the courthouse stone steps, cameras lined up, journalists jostling for a better view. You hear shutters snapping, a low murmur rolling across the crowd like distant thunder. Then the car door opens, and out steps Rolf Harris. No wobble board, no easy grin, no paintbrush, just a frail man in his 80s, clutching his wife's hand. Walking into Southwark Crown Court in London to face charges that threatened to obliterate his legacy. The trial began in April 2014. The charges were specific, 12 counts of indecent assault, spanning from the late 1960s to the 1980s, involving 4 victims. One was as young as 7 or 8 at the time. The courtroom itself felt more like theatre than justice barristers in wigs, reporters scribbling notes, spectators craning to catch every word. You sit in the dark now, imagining the air in that courtroom, heavy, stale, every cough or shuffle amplified by tension. The prosecution painted Harris as a man who used his fame as camouflage. He wasn't some shadowy figure in alleyways. He was the smiling entertainer on stage, the family-friendly man who slipped past suspicion precisely because of his visibility. They argued that his charm was a mask, that behind the wobbleboard and paintbrush lived someone who exploited access to children. The defense, meanwhile, urged the jury to remember the Harris they knew, beloved, charitable, wholesome. They suggested the accusers were motivated by money or attention. The clash of these two images, the national treasure versus the alleged predator, was the central drama. Here's the mainstream historical fact to ground you. Harris pleaded not guilty to all charges. He maintained his innocence from the start of the trial until the end, never wavering in his public stance. He even went so far as to claim that while he may have been overly affectionate or tactile, he had never committed a crime. That insistence became one of the refrains of the defense. And then there were the witnesses. Women, now middle-aged, standing in the witness box, recounting memories from decades earlier. The detail that sticks with you is their courage, describing what happened in public, in front of strangers, while the man they accused sat only feet away. One said she had been groped at a youth event. Another described being molested in Harris's own home. Their voices cracked, but they held firm. Investigators still question whether the atmosphere of reverence around Harris in the 1970s and 80s helped silence those voices for so long. Would a jury back then have believed them? Or would they have been dismissed as over-imaginative children accusing a national darling? The question lingers like dust motes in the courtroom light. Now, a quirky tidbit that feels almost absurd against the seriousness of the trial. During recesses, reporters noted that Harris would sometimes doodle on notepads, sketching little caricatures, as if trying to slip back into the role of entertainer, even in a criminal doc. One journalist swore he saw Harris draw a quick cartoon of himself with his trademark wobbleboard, a man clinging to a vanished identity, even as the walls closed in. The testimony rolled on for weeks. The prosecution built its case with precision, accuser after accuser, detail after detail, each story echoing the others in its familiarity. The defense countered with character witnesses, pointing to his decades of work with children, charities, and the absence of complaints until Operation Yewtree. It was a clash not just of facts, but of narratives. And outside the courtroom, the world watched. Newspapers ran daily updates. Former fans argued online, some insisting the allegations had to be false, others saying they had suspected for years that something wasn't right. It wasn't just a trial of a man. It was a trial of memory, of nostalgia, of how much you're willing to question the icons of your childhood. As you lean back, you feel the unease settle in. Courtrooms don't deal in feelings, they deal in verdicts. But in April 2014, as the trial of Rolf Harris began, the feeling was unmistakable. The painted smile was gone, and in its place stood a man fighting not just for his freedom, but for the version of himself he'd sold to the world. The trial was theater, but the stakes were real. At the end of it, 12 citizens on a jury would decide whether the entertainer was guilty or innocent. The wobbleboard was silent. The brush was dry. The applause had long since faded. Only the truth, or at least, the jury's best approximation of it remained. The date is the 30th of June 2014. You imagine yourself among the reporters clustered outside Southwark Crown Court, leaning over railings, listening for the verdict. Hours tick by, and then, at last, the jury files in. Inside, the courtroom is hushed, so still you could hear the scratch of a fountain pen. Rolf Harris sits in the dock, hands folded, eyes down. The foreman of the jury stands. One by one, 12 verdicts are read aloud. Guilty, guilty, guilty. All 12 counts of indecent assault. The words ring like hammer blows, louder than any wobbleboard ever could. You hear the gasps. Some spectators bow their heads, others stare in disbelief. Outside, journalists break into a sprint, phones to their ears, news flashes blinking across the world. For the public, the shock is seismic. The beloved entertainer who once sang for queens and children alike is now a convicted sex offender. The mainstream historical fact is stark. Harris was found guilty of assaulting 4 female victims between 1968 and 1986. One was as young as 8. Another was a close friend of his daughter. The pattern the prosecution painted opportunistic. Abuse hidden behind a mask of charm was now confirmed by a jury of his peers. But here's the strange, almost surreal detail. As the verdicts were read, Harris reportedly sat nearly motionless, doodling with a as if the courtroom drama unfolding around him wasn't quite real. That image, a man idly sketching while his legacy crumbled, stuck with journalists. Some said it showed denial. Others thought it was simply his way of coping. Investigators still question whether the guilty verdicts could have come sooner. For years, the whispers had been there, the uneasy stories, the too familiar touches. If complaints had been taken seriously in the 1970s or 1980s, would Harris have faced justice earlier? Or was it only the cultural shift of Operation Yewtree that finally broke the silence? In the hours after the conviction, institutions moved quickly. the BBC announced it would never air his programs again. Music retailers purged his albums. Galleries quietly boxed up his paintings. Even his portrait of the Queen became an awkward relic, hidden away from public display. Overnight, Harris's name was scrubbed from the cultural record, and for the victims, those 12 guilty verdicts weren't just words, they were a validation of memories carried, often in silence, for decades. The courtroom, with its wood panels and dusty files, became a place where voices long ignored were finally heard. Yet, outside the courthouse, you could still hear disbelief from some fans who clung to the Harris of their childhood, unable or unwilling to reconcile the two faces, the man on the canvas and the man in the dock. It's a fracture that still lingers. The quirky tidbit. In the hours after the verdict, bookmakers in Britain actually closed their celebrity disgrace betting markets, fearing that what had seemed like dark humor had turned to real. One headline read, "No more bets the fall of a national treasure is complete." You sit here in your own quiet space, hearing the hum of your fan, and feel the weight of that moment. Guilty on 12 counts. A lifetime of applause replaced by silence. A painted smile shattered beyond repair. The wobbleboard, the paintbrush, the meadows, all of it now reframed by those verdicts. Harris wasn't just convicted, he was redefined, and once the gavel fell, there was no going back. The calendar flips forward from late June 2014 to early July. You find yourself outside Southwark Crown Court once again. Except this time, it's not verdicts you're waiting for. It's sentencing. The energy is heavier, thicker, like rain clouds waiting to burst. The press pens are full, victims are seated quietly, and the world is ready to see how justice will measure the scale of Rolf Harris's fall. Inside the oak-panelled courtroom, Mr. Justice Sweeney prepares to deliver his judgment. His words are deliberate, steady, each syllable carved out like chiseled stone. You have shown no remorse for your crimes. He speaks of the lasting harm inflicted, of how the offences were committed under the cloak of fame and trust, of how children and young women bore the weight of trauma for decades, while Harris carried on as if untouched. Then, the sentence. 5 years and 9 months in prison. You let that sink in. Not 5 months, not a suspended term. Nearly 6 years in a cell for a man once knighted, once painted as wholesome. The mainstream historical fact here is clear. Harris, aged 84 at the time, was immediately taken into custody, stripped of freedom as quickly as his honors would soon be stripped from the record. His conviction wasn't symbolic, it carried real prison time, setting a precedent that even late-life offenders could be held to account. And yet, here's the quirky tidbit. A courtroom sketch artist, forbidden to draw from photographs, captured Harris with a cartoonishly sagging face, biro in hand. The image went viral, not for artistry, but for how surreal it looked, more like a caricature than a portrait. For an entertainer who spent a lifetime sketching others, being reduced to a courtroom doodle felt like poetic irony. Investigators still question whether the sentence was long enough. Critics argued that considering the severity of crimes, the span of decades, and the breach of trust, Harris should have received far more. Others noted his advanced age and health, debating whether lengthy incarceration for a man near the end of life achieved justice or vengeance. Outside, reactions split sharply. For victims, 5 years and 9 months meant acknowledgement, a tangible consequence. It wasn't here about numbers on paper, but about recognition that what they had endured mattered in the eyes of the law. For Harris's dwindling defenders, it was a stunning sight. A national treasure in a prison van, windows blackened, driving off to an institution rather than a recording studio. The stripping of freedom went hand in hand with public disgrace. Shops pulled merchandise, schools painted over murals, and even long-forgotten novelty records were recalled or deleted from streaming services. It wasn't just about erasing his presence. It was about cutting the ties between Harris and innocence, between art and safety, and prison itself. This was no gentle retreat. Harris was sent first to HMP Bullingdon, a Category B prison in Oxfordshire. He was reportedly placed on a vulnerable prisoner's wing, designed for inmates who might be targeted by others. From applause to isolation, the shift was absolute. Imagine that. 1 month, you're still selling out theaters. The next, you're queuing for lunch on a plastic tray, waiting to be locked in for the night. The irony is thick. Harris once sang about 2 little boys with wooden horses, a song that brought tears to audiences. Now, the same voice was reduced to roll calls and cell doors slamming. Still, the sentence did not close the debate. 5 years and 9 months became both a marker of justice and a symbol of unresolved questions. Too little, too late, or simply what the law could give within its framework. As you sit in your own quiet room, the fans hum steady. You can almost hear the silence of a cell, the echo of footsteps down a corridor. Fame turned to infamy. Canvas turned to concrete walls. 5 years, 9 months, the number may be finite, but the consequences ripple without end. You follow the prison van in your imagination. The one with blacked-out windows rolling down Oxfordshire roads in July 2014. Inside sits Rolf Harris, 84 years old, shackled not by chains but by circumstance, heading toward HMP Bullingdon. For decades, he painted himself as a national uncle figure, but now, he enters a world where no one cares about wobble boards or royal portraits. Life behind prison gates is stripped bare. You wake at dawn to the buzz of fluorescent lights, shuffle in line for powdered eggs and lukewarm tea, and spend hours waiting for the clang of keys. For Harris, once accustomed to global tours and red carpets, the daily routine at Bullingdon or later at HMP Stafford, where he was transferred, must have felt like a crushing descent. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Reports confirmed Harris was moved to HMP Stafford, a facility with a vulnerable prisoners' wing. Many inmates there were convicted of sexual offenses, creating a bitter irony. Celebrities who once seemed untouchable, now living in rows of small concrete cells, equal only in disgrace. But quirky details slip through the cracks. One former inmate described Harris being asked to perform to little boys in the prison yard, not as a celebration, but as a kind of cruel taunt. Another story suggests fellow inmates mocked him by wobbling plastic trays like his old wobble board routine. Whether exaggerated or not, the image is striking. An entertainer defined by novelty sounds reduced to echoes in a hostile courtyard. Investigators still question whether Harris ever truly faced prison as an equal inmate. Reports of extra protection, restricted movements, and quiet segregation suggest he may have been shielded from the worst. Others insist that no amount of protection could blunt the humiliation of being jeered, spat at, and shunned even by those society already deemed outcasts. Behind the gates, Harris's health faltered. Arthritis, frailty, and age weighed heavily. He reportedly kept to himself, reading, sketching quietly, or writing letters. Imagine that. The man who once filled stadiums confined to graphite on scrap paper, sketches of nothing in particular, simply to keep his hands busy. But the outside world didn't forget. Tabloids ran constant stories how fellow prisoners laughed at his fall, how his meals were as bland as his days, how fans who once lined up for autographs now crossed the street to avoid his name. Even charities he had supported issued public statements, cutting ties so thoroughly you'd think he had never existed. Still, behind the gates, life carried its grim rhythm. Roll call at 7 a.m, yard time under grey skies, locked doors at 8 p.m. The applause of television audiences was replaced with the rattle of keys on a guard's belt. That sound became the only indicator of movement, of time itself. And here's the eerie contrast. Harris once sang upbeat novelty tunes for children, filling living rooms with cheer. In prison, those same songs, if hummed, would have echoed like a parody of lost innocence. You might ask yourself, what does accountability look like for someone nearing the end of life? Is it the cell, the stripping away of honors, or the silence that follows when no one sings back? Harris's punishment wasn't only measured in years served, it was in the quiet suffocation of relevance, the collapse of legacy, and the knowledge that every portrait, every note, was now reframed by his crimes. And yet, within those walls, he endured, not glamorous, not heroic, simply existing until the next clang of metal and the next day of institutional beige. Fame could not survive here, only routine did. As you sit now, the hum of your fan constant. Try swapping it with the sterile buzz of prison fluorescence. Imagine your walls bare, your comforts rationed. That's the world Harris lived in behind the Getzer world, where applause never followed, and where the silence was absolute. Time stretches, and the courtroom drama doesn't end with sentencing. Even after the gavel falls, the legal system continues its slow churn. Rolf Harris, ever determined to challenge his fate, begins a series of appeals. You picture him, frail and quiet, seated in a legal office or courtroom, poring over thick bundles of papers. A lifetime of performance replaced by procedural documents. The mainstream historical fact: Harris's first appeal, lodged shortly after his conviction in 2014, argued that the trial was unfair. His legal team claimed errors in jury direction and questioned whether his age had influenced the court process. They sought to reduce his sentence or overturn the conviction entirely. In 2015, the Court of Appeal dismissed most of these arguments, affirming the original verdict and sentence. But there's a quirky detail that stands out. During one hearing, court attendees noted Harris doodling in the margins of his legal briefstini, caricatures of himself and the courtroom. You can almost see it. A man who spent decades crafting images for others, now sketching the very arena that had condemned him. It's a strange persistence of habit, an echo of the entertainer beneath the convicted offender. Investigators still question whether the appeals process adequately addressed concerns raised about the long time span of allegations. The offenses dated back decades, witnesses had faded memories, and societal norms had shifted. Some legal scholars wondered if the jury had struggled to reconcile these factors, though ultimately the appeal courts found no miscarriage of justice. Harris also sought leave to appeal to the Supreme Court. That request, like the earlier appeals, was refused. By 2016, legal avenues were all but exhausted. The message was clear. The convictions stood, the sentence remained, and the public record of his crimes was fixed. The emotional weight of these battles can't be overstated. Even as an older man, Harris faced each day knowing the appeals were unlikely to succeed, yet he pursued them nonetheless. The persistence can be read as defiance or as a last attempt to reclaim control over a life unmoored by scandal. Quirkier still, in the intervening years, some small galleries in Australia quietly removed Harris's works from public display. citing potential legal liability if continued exhibition was seen as supporting a convicted sex offender. It wasn't just music stores. Art institutions also reacted, highlighting the pervasive reach of a criminal conviction across multiple spheres of cultural life. Outside the courtroom, the world debated broader implications. Could fame provide protection for decades? Would cultural institutions be more vigilant moving forward? How does society reconcile the artist's work with the artist's crimes? These questions persist, often without easy answers. And for the victims, every failed appeal was a reaffirmation. The law had, after years of delay, recognized the validity of their accusations. It was slow, painstaking justice, but in a sense, it was justice nonetheless. As you imagine Harris, sketching quietly, legal papers spread before him, you feel the paradox. A man once celebrated for creativity, now creatively navigating legal documents in a battle that could not restore his reputation. The appeals, procedural and austere, cannot undo the human stories at the heart of the trial, nor the shift in public memory that now permanently defines him. So the lessons linger. Even the most persistent attempts to rewrite history cannot erase the consequences of past actions. Fame may shield you for a time, but in the end, the law and memory both have long reach. You step outside the courtroom and into the glare of the media. Headlines scream across newspapers, scrolling on websites, lighting up television screens worldwide. Rolf Harris, convicted, beloved entertainer falls, national treasure no more. The hum of public debate is deafening. Some are horrified, others are incredulous. For decades, the entertainer had been a fixture in homes. Now he's the subject of shock and revulsion. The mainstream historical fact is stark. Following the conviction and sentencing, media coverage intensified globally. British tabloids ran daily updates, documentaries were pulled, and his once popular shows were removed from the BBC archives. The public was forced to reconcile to images simultaneously: the playful, artistic icon and the convicted sex offender. Yet there's a quirky, almost surreal element in this storm. Social media accounts, previously devoted to Harris memorabilia, turned overnight into spaces of debate, apology, and sometimes dark humor. Fans shared stories of attending his shows as children, juxtaposed with news reports of his crimes, creating a collective dissonance that fascinated sociologists. One Twitter post famously joked about the wobble board of justice, highlighting how quickly humor becomes a coping mechanism. Investigators still question whether the media frenzy influenced public perception of justice. The saturation coverage meant that the trial's narrative extended beyond the courtroom, shaping opinions before, during, and after the verdict. Some argue it provided validation for victims, while others fear it risked sensationalism that could overshadow careful legal deliberation. In Australia, the reaction was equally pronounced. Harris had been a national figure, awarded an Officer of the Order of Australia. Political figures debated whether his honours should be rescinded. Indeed, in April 2015, Harris was stripped of both his CBE and the Order of Australia, a symbolic act signalling that accolades could not shield wrongdoing. The formal process of rescinding these awards, once considered untouchable, highlighted society's shift toward accountability over reverence. The public debate was not confined to institutions. Families, schools, and community groups who had once embraced Harris's work had to reconsider the media they displayed. Children's art books, television reruns, and even simple mentions of his name became points of contention. Libraries removed his work from circulation. Museums quietly relocated his paintings. The entertainer's legacy was dissected in living rooms across continents, and yet, amid the outrage, there was reflection. Social commentators pointed out a larger cultural failure: how society, institutions, and media had normalized celebrity protection, allowing misconduct to remain hidden. Harris became both an individual cautionary tale and a symbol of systemic blind spots. Here's the human detail that lingers. Victims expressed relief that their voices were heard, but also frustration at the decades-long delay. Their stories had been dismissed, overlooked, or silenced for years. When the media storm hit, it validated years of private suffering, making the world finally listen. Even now, you can picture the duality. A public still trying to reconcile childhood memories of a smiling, paint-splattered entertainer with the reality of the convictions. Some cling to nostalgia, others confront the uncomfortable truth. It's a reminder that public personas are fragile constructs, and that trust, once broken, leaves permanent marks. So, as the fan hums in your quiet room, consider the paradox. Fame can elevate you, but it cannot erase accountability. And in the case of Rolf Harris, the applause has long faded, leaving only echoes of memory, reckoning, and reflection. Time marches on, and even the most persistent public figures cannot outrun age or consequence. Rolf Harris, now in his late 80s, faces the slow erosion of health within the prison system. You imagine him in a small cell, the light dim, his body betraying him in ways the stage never did. Arthritis stiffens his hands, his eyesight fades, and the once vaudevillian energy that carried him across concert halls and television studios is replaced by the quiet, relentless rhythm of daily survival. The mainstream historical fact is that Harris's health became a major consideration for prison authorities. Reports indicate that he was moved to facilities equipped to handle elderly or vulnerable inmates, and that medical care was frequently administered for age-related ailments. He served part of his sentence under medical supervision before being released on license in May 2017. Having served nearly 3 years, yet there's a quirky side to it. Even in confinement, Harris reportedly continued to sketch in small notebooks, drawing caricatures of prison staff or simple landscapes to pass the time. For a man whose identity had been intertwined with art for decades, this private continuation of practice offered a measure of solace. The pencil scratched across paper, a fragile echo of former glory amid institutional monotony. Investigators still question whether his late-life imprisonment had the intended impact. Was justice fully served, given his age and health? Some observers suggest that serving sentences in one's 80s provides symbolic accountability more than punitive consequence, while others insist that even symbolic action is essential in cases of historic abuse. Outside prison walls, the world continued to digest the fall. Harris's name remained toxic in popular culture, and former collaborators and institutions maintained distance. His art exhibitions were cancelled, and television networks removed reruns of his shows, yet whispers persisted in certain collector circles that his paintings, rare and controversial, still held value, proof that cultural artifacts and moral judgment often exist in uneasy tension. You might note the emotional resonance. Victims' voices continued to carry weight, but they also confronted society's ambivalence about aging offenders. How do we process the accountability of someone no longer a threat, someone whose life is measured more in frailty than menace? This remains an unresolved tension for psychologists, legal scholars, and the public alike. The media, for its part, continued periodic coverage of Harris's health, reflecting ongoing public fascination with his decline. Articles often highlighted his isolation, restricted activities, and medical visits, portraying a man whose private life had become inseparable from his public disgrace. And here's the quiet irony. Harris, once a symbol of vitality and accessibility, now depended on care for the most basic needs. The vibrant entertainer who toured the globe was reduced to navigating institutional routines. Under surveillance, in a world that no longer applauded him, his paintbrush, wobbleboard, and charm were irrelevant here. Only survival mattered. As you sit in your space, the fan buzzing softly, imagine the trajectory: fame and creativity replaced by confinement and medical routines, the applause of generations replaced by silence, the public record of guilt and disgrace overshadowing decades of cultural contribution. It's a somber reminder of how quickly fortune can reverse, and how enduring consequences are, even in the twilight years. In the end, Harris's story serves as a meditation on vulnerability, accountability, and the impermanence of fame. The man who once captivated millions was now a quiet figure, his legacy inseparable from the crimes that redefined him. The story moves inexorably toward its quiet, inevitable close. On the 5th of May 2023, Rolf Harris passed away at the age of 93. You can picture it in your mind. A final curtain, not on a stage, not in front of cheering crowds, but in the stillness of a hospital room or private residence. The man who had once painted queens, strummed wobbleboards, and commanded living rooms worldwide was gone. The mainstream historical fact. Harris's death was widely reported by major news outlets, confirming both the date and his age. Tributes were muted, reflecting the duality of his life: a celebrated entertainer and a convicted sex offender. Media coverage carefully balanced acknowledgement of his artistic achievements with recognition of the harm he caused. A quirky, almost surreal detail lingers. In certain Australian communities, small art circles quietly held private moments of reflection, placing paintbrushes on the desks of local art schools in tribute to Harris's technical skill, not his personal life. This paradox honoring the artist while condemning the man mirrors the tension that had followed him for decades. Investigators and commentators still question whether society has fully reckoned with the protective mechanisms that allowed Harris to offend for so long. The role of media, institutions, and public reverence in delaying accountability remains a point of reflection. Historians debate how cultural adulation can inadvertently shield predators, a question that Harris's life forces communities to confront. Public reactions were muted yet reflective. Newspapers highlighted both the fall from grace and the decades of achievement. Social media threads buzzed with conflicting emotions. Some shared memories of childhood shows and paintings. Others reiterated the harm he caused. The contrast serves as a stark reminder that legacy is rarely simple. Even now, galleries, museums, and networks navigate Harris's artistic contributions with caution. Some of his works remain in storage, some in collections, but nearly all are contextualized with disclaimers or historical framing. The man's death did not erase his crimes, nor did it fully restore his reputation. What remains is complex, a legacy inextricably entwined with achievement and transgression. For victims, Harris's death closes one chapter but does not erase trauma. Many expressed relief that he would no longer cause harm, while others noted that justice had been achieved years before through conviction and imprisonment. The interplay of personal healing and public accountability underscores the enduring impact of his actions. And here's a quiet human reflection. Fame is temporary. Applause fades, and even artistic skill cannot outlive ethical judgment. Harris's life offers a cautionary tale: how trust can be exploited, how charisma can mask transgression, and how society eventually, if belatedly, confronts wrongdoing. So, as the fan hums softly in your room, you consider the paradox. A man who once seemed immortal in cultural memory now exists only in print, archives, and recollection, his legacy forever fractured. The brush is down, the wobble board silent, the curtain fallen. This is the final reckoning. A life that touched millions, tainted by betrayal, closed at last. And perhaps, in the stillness, we are reminded that every story, no matter how bright, must answer to the measure of justice and consequence. You lean back, letting the story settle like dust in a quiet room. The hum of your fan becomes a rhythm, a heartbeat of reflection. What does it mean to watch someone rise to fame, captivate a nation, and then fall so completely? Rolf Harris's life is a meditation on the fragility of public trust, the veneer of celebrity, and the weight of accountability. Even as you consider the brushstrokes and wobble boards, you are reminded that human complexity defies simple categorization. Talent and wrongdoing can coexist, a dissonance that challenges nostalgia, admiration, and memory itself. For victims, the narrative is stark: justice delayed, yet finally served. For society, it is a warning: idolize cautiously, scrutinize diligently, and never assume that charm is proof of character. And still, life moves forward. You might pick up a paintbrush, watch a children's show, or hum an old tune. Each act becomes part of the broader reflection on innocence, trust, and the shadows that lie beneath public facades. The story leaves you unsettled, contemplative, and, perhaps, a little wiser about the stories you choose to carry forward. Now, the room is quiet. You are left with the duality of memory and accountability. Fame fades, time passes, but lessons endure. Rolf Harris is gone. The legacy, fractured as it is, remains as a mirror reminding you of the complexity of human life, the permanence of consequence, and the importance of listening, always, to those whose voices were long silenced.